We're starting off the podcast. What's up, everybody? Welcome to my podcast for this class for the case study project number 2. And today we're kind of just basically discussing what and how mental health is understood in our society and how people are treated based on racial and socioeconomic factors that ultimately determine who is being used for case studies, how people are labeled in our society, etc., and just bringing up some specific examples, and hopefully that y'all can tune in and enjoy. First off, let's talk about this idea of normalcy in mental health research. Psychologists and clinicians often rely on tests like diagnostic tools to figure out whether someone is struggling with a disorder or going through something temporary. These tools are meant to be objective and fair, but at the end of the day, they are not. At the end of the day, they always end up not being fair. These tests were developed a long time ago. They were developed decades ago. And they've used a very specific population, usually white, middle-class, English-speaking Americans. And that group was kind of treated as the baseline for the standard of what it is to be normal. And, everyone else was measured against it. So I'll think of all of the other marginalized communities and how much in the past that may have been amplified, right? Like, think about Black, Hispanic, and just immigrant communities in general, how if you're already put at a disadvantage as an immigrant coming into this country, now you have quite literal science against you. The American Psychological Association has admitted this in their 2016 monograph on testing and assessment among communities of color. They saw that early psychologists assumed that their tools were culture free, but that obviously was just not true. These tests don't account for difference in language, education, life experience, and this can produce something called test bias. That includes things like slope bias, where a test is, I talked about this in my paper, slope bias, a test that is more accurate for one group more than the other, or intercept bias, where the average scores differ when outcomes are the same. So let's pause here real quick just to go over a definition. To define a key term. That is bias. So bias is more than just a personal prejudice in this specific. It refers to a systemic tendencies that unfairly favor certain groups over others, especially in the way information is collected, interpreted, and used. So we often assume that science and data are neutral, but they're not. That's because data reflects the world as it is, and that's not necessarily how it should be. So when scientific tools are used and trained on data from a world full of inequality, racial injustice, class divides, and think about all the other factors that play into socioeconomic divide, they get baked into the system, and that becomes a serious issue. Let me just give you a quick example. Let's say a psychologist test was created in a mostly white suburban community. Now imagine using that same test in a predominantly Black urban school. The behaviors that are common or acceptable in one place might look totally different in the other, but the test doesn't know that at all. So it just treats those differences as problems. So the difference in the community already is setting off an alert just for a simple difference. This brings us to what's the most important point that I want to elicit and explain to this crowd, is that science is not neutral. We like to think that science is fact-based. I mean, even the word science is just like, wow, like if someone brings up a scientific fact or statistic, it's very easy for you to believe them, right? We like to think of science as fact-based, objective, and above politics, but science is it's made by people, so it often brings values and beliefs, personal values and beliefs, and creates blind spots for anything really created, and that comes into play here. Carol Anashensel and Joe Phelan, two sociologists who study mental health, argue that definitions of mental illness are socially constructed. that means that they're shaped by time, place, and culture we live in, not just biology. So when researchers are, well, let alone this gives the power to researchers to define what is normal, but when researchers define normal based on limited experiences, they end up excluding a huge part of the population. This doesn't mean that science is bad or it's all science is biased. It just means that we have to hold science accountable for what it is. We brought this up in our class about algorithms. I mean, algorithms can be extremely biased, and like I mentioned, just the different, like when we were talking about policing and the amount of police being sent to certain neighborhoods, right? That's already a target and a bias based on socioeconomic and racial factors. That's just not okay, you know? Look, we've discussed slope bias and intercept bias, and I mean, even in class we brought up the spirometer. We did an example with the spirometer, and that goes to show how easily science can be manipulated and skewed. And one specific example that I personally found very interesting, and something that I wrote about in my case study 1 paper, was the school to prison pipeline. So let me explain the school to prison pipeline to you. So the school to prison pipeline is a reoccurring a pattern within young, a lot of the time, Black and Hispanic youth, in lower income areas that attend these elementary and middle schools. There is, like in every class, there's always class clowns. Some tend to be rambunctious and loud, and oftentimes, interrupting class and being a disruption sometimes. So, in this specific case, the school to prison pipeline, kids are being labeled as not mentally ill, but aggressive, defiant, and ultimately, instead of looking in and seeing if this child has ADHD or ADD or some sort of hyperactive disorder, kids are just labeled with these very harsh terms, like I said, aggressive and just defiant, and they're being placed in alternative disciplinary schools. And so this is where it becomes a problem, because in these disciplinary schools, they are usually private, they're not publicly funded, which means that they're lacking a lot of funding, and they don't really have a lot of proper oversight on these children. The ACLU refers to it as shadow systems, schools that remove students from the public eye and leave them with very little academic support. And so with this, students, they fall behind academically, they fall into worse things such as, drugs, alcohol, or whatever that may be. And I don't know, it kind of supports harmful behavior, because then you're surrounded by all these aggressive and rambunctious children, as they're labeled, people who just need proper academic and what's the academic oversight. And so this leads to like a long-term effect on self-esteem, mental health, the way that these children are going to grow up and be in the future of our America. It's just not a good solution to helping these children, and it's becoming a progressively worse issue. I really think that there needs to be more outreach in these low-income communities to diagnose children with ADHD, ADD, or maybe just looking into learning disorders, because that is something that is so often overlooked, and in a lot of these affluent communities, in affluent private schools, affluent, just better, higher income areas, their public schools have more funding, and these children are getting more attention. Therefore, they come out to be more successful at the end of the day because they got the attention that they deserved. Unlike in lower income communities where these kids are overlooked, and in these low income communities there happens to be a higher population of black and Hispanic communities. So it really becomes an issue, and it's one of those things where it will take a lot to fix going into the future. But I really hope that it is something that is fixed and given the proper attention, because I truly believe that it deserves to have it. So another thing that I'd like to discuss is folk ideas. Folk ideas similar to stereotypes. I guess it does fit under the category of stereotypes. It's categorizing different racial groups to have certain predispositions that impact them in the long term. For example, like I mentioned, there's often the folk idea that black children are more aggressive, and instead of looking into seeing their ADHD patterns or their patterns in their learning, seeing if they have a learning disability, they're just labeled as aggressive and unteachable, which is I hate that term, unteachable. For example, the folk idea that immigrant communities aren't intelligent. These people are feeble-minded just because they come from another country, or that autism only affects young white children. That's not true. All of these little folk ideas are passed down from generation through generation and determine who are being studied, who is the biggest group of people being affected by whatever it may be. But all of these folk ideas and stereotypes, they bleed into science. And when science is supposed to be the one thing that we can rely on without stereotype and bias, it truly is unfortunate, because we have to see the negative outcomes on marginalized communities, and that's how it's always been. But I mean, at the end of the day, I really think this is an issue that can be resolved, and I think we should really be more observant. Conversations like these are very essential to build a positive step into the future. Science, when left unexamined, can reinforce a lot of inequalities. I really think that us as our generation should put our foot forward into a positive initiative, because I think it's possible. Thank you very much for listening. I really do appreciate you listening to me sit here and yap to you about how socioeconomic factors, racial factors, folk ideas, the school to prison pipeline specifically, the spirometer, slope bias, how all of that plays into how science can be easily swayed, and maybe swayed's not the correct term, but how science can be tainted. How science can be tainted very easily by different socioeconomic factors, as well as racial factors, that most of the time continue to marginalize certain groups of people and put people at disadvantages. And like we talked about in class, I mean, algorithms also play a huge part in it. But I hope you enjoyed listening, and hopefully at the end of the day you think about this issue a little bit more. And yeah, thank you very much, you guys.